Every once in a while, something incredible comes our way that we can't wait to share. Good thing I have this YouTube channel, right? Not too long ago, I had the privilege of discussing with Dr. Allison Jr. what counts as historical fact in the Gospels. A particular standout was the odd scene in Mark 5, where Jesus' actions seem more fictional than remembered. But here's where it gets really interesting. Dr. Dennis R. MacDonald pointed out that this story might just be imitating classics like Homer's Odyssey and Vergil's Aeneid, with a heavier lean on the Odyssey. This imitation, or mimesis, isn't just copying. It's about adapting these famous tales for a new audience. Through my time with MythVision, I've seen many scholars suggest such influences on Luke Acts, but suggestions for Mark's Gospel have been scarce. Yet, there are exceptions, like Dr. Robyn Walsh, who sees echoes of Vergil's Aeneid in Mark. Then there's Chris Rosser from Oklahoma Christian University. His insightful piece not only bridges the gap between believers and skeptics, but also demonstrates a deep understanding of Mark's intentions using both Jewish and non-Jewish sources. This has sparked hope for more fruitful dialogues across beliefs. If Mark is layering his narrative this way, what more could we be missing in the New Testament? Ready to dive into a world where cyclops, witches, cave monsters, and demigod heroes mingle? Let's embark on the epic quest to uncover how deep these ancient influences run, and perhaps see Jesus in a new light as he triumphs in mythical battles. Who's with me? Professor Macmillan concluded class that day with an insightful observation: the odd we passages of Acts, where narrative perspective awkwardly shifts from third person to first person plural. Those odd we passages seem to coincide with stories in and around the city of Troas. I'm not sure why, but it's interesting to note. Yes, it was an interesting observation. Similar to others, I had the privilege of hearing Dr. Lynn Macmillan share during the 2 semesters we co-taught Bible and classical literature for honors students at Oklahoma Christian University. Indeed, his comment was the first time I had heard a connection made between the mysterious we passages and the ancient city of Troy, since Troas was proximate to Old Troy and conveyed association between Aeneas of Troy and epic stories about the origins of Roman power. Lynn's observation opened my eyes and ears to a possibility that the we passages of Acts might be understood literarily and not historically, that the shift in language proximate with stories in and around Troas, a shift in language most akin to Odysseus' narration of his own travels after the sack of Troy, might signal an intentional intertextuality and not simply indicate that Luke joined Paul's company at Troas, as has been widely assumed. Lynn became, for me, unwitting muse, or more likely, as masterful teacher, Lynn intentionally ignites imagination with questions so that students might make associations that yield new insights and bring to light possible but undiscovered meanings. Lynn may have been an unwitting muse, but he has been my muse nonetheless. The following is offered in honor of distinguished Professor Lynn Macmillan in hopes that attending to imitation and inversion of unfamiliar story might yield new insight and bring to light possible but undiscovered meaning out of Mark's telling of Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac. We will explore the possibility that the odd Latin loanword, legio, or legion, signals intertextuality with Vergil's Aeneid, specifically hearing Hercules rend open the cavern of Cacus, groans and cracks of rock roots snapping as a stony precipice is heaved into churning waters, summoning unexpected daylight to transform the darkness of a deathly monster's lair. Hearing Hercules in Mark 5 confirms the meaning and trajectory of the gospel as it unfolds in Mark's telling of the story of Jesus. Gospel writers like Mark are clever, masterful storytellers, and story itself is a profound delivery device for truth. This essay offers opportunity to listen, see, discover, and learn from the imitation and inversion unfamiliar story. Such was the aim of our classes together, helping students encounter biblical narratives alongside story from the ancient and classical worlds. Such is also the aim of this essay dedicated to Dr. Lynn Macmillan, because an epic festschrift, or celebrated writing, is also bearer of heroic kleos, fame, glory. This project playfully applies Dennis MacDonald's Mimesis criticism. Playfully applies because MacDonald also plays the muse, igniting minds and sparking debate about Homer's lurking presence in the Gospels and Acts. And my hope here is to playfully imitate his approach. My aim is not to show that Mark intended Aeneid 8 as hypotext or model for the episode of Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac. Rather, I want to ask what we might learn if we assume the name Legion signals Vergil's story of Hercules and the monster Cacus. Indeed, MacDonald himself asserts that the authors of the Gospels did not imitate Vergil's Latin epic, at least not as profoundly as Mark and Luke imitated Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. Hence, from the outset, I am being playful, bullish, willfully transgressing the bounds of the muse's approach. We plunge straight to the center where the smoke surges highest, to discern what might be discovered between the Gerasene tomb and the Palatine cavern. MacDonald argues that gospel writers, especially Mark, Luke, and John, intentionally imitate Greek and Roman story to present Jesus as a superior rival to the gods and heroes of familiar story. Mimesis is imitation, and the imitation of earlier story is a hallmark of ancient literary practices. Essentially, the New Testament can, and perhaps should, be read as not only continuous with the Hebrew Bible, but also as ancient Mediterranean literature that mirrors, mimics, Greek and Roman story. As MacDonald describes, Greek education largely involved imitation of the epics. What Greeks call mimesis, Romans called it imitatio. Homeric influence thus appears in many genres of ancient composition. Poetry, of course, but also histories, biographies, and novels. One must not confuse such imitations with plagiarism, willful misrepresentation, or pitiful gullibility. Rather, by evoking literary antecedents, authors sought to impress the reader with the superiority of the imitation in literary style, philosophical insights, or ethical values. Literary mimesis often promoted a sophisticated rivalry between the esteemed models and their innovating successors. Certainly, this is the case between Vergil's Aeneid and the Homeric epics. The Aeneid represents Vergil's resourceful adaptation and appropriation of Greek's epic tradition, newly transformed so as to celebrate Rome's divine election and elevate Romanitas, the Roman way, to ascendancy as the universal human ideal for a new millennium of Roman power. The story of Aeneas exists as both imitation and invention, continuous and discontinuous with familiar epic, and Through Vergil's ingenious literary invention, the Aeneid became the surprising fulfillment of its revered Greek predecessor at a time when the Homeric epics continued to enjoy the status of sacred texts throughout the Hellenized world. Vergil's imitation of Homer is evident and easily detectable. Mark and Mimesis is, to be sure, another story. MacDonald admits, clearly the Gospel of Mark does not advertise its Homeric hypertextuality and transvaluation as transparently as the Aeneid. Nevertheless, Mark does incorporate mimetic markers that signal epic literature, aspects of Mark's project to embed traditions about Jesus within a narrative that would present him as superior to heroes of Greek mythology, just as he presented him as superior to Moses, Jonah, and Elijah. Also through imitation of familiar Jewish story. As an example, he suggests that modern readers have been blind to many of Mark's most significant mimetic markers, significant personal and place names. In large part, this blindness is caused by modern translations that transliterate names without translating them. MacDonald suggests that Mark not only created significant names, but also frequently uses them to evoke antecedents in the Iliad and the Odyssey. Mark, as inventor of names, positions him squarely within the poetic, literary, and rhetorical conventions of the day. Here we might compare approaches to the gospel by evaluating the fruits of two sense-making strategies related to Mark as inventor of names. In Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, Richard Bauckham acknowledges that names in the Gospels are a phenomenon that has never been satisfactorily explained. And raises the question as to why Matthew and Luke omit certain names in their redaction of Mark, making a historical argument that by the time Matthew and Luke wrote, certain figures had been forgotten or had become too obscure to include by name. For example, Bartimaeus, Mark 10:46-52, a blind man encountered and healed near Jericho, is not mentioned by name in Matthew and Luke. As explanation of the omission, Bauckham posits, with Bartimaeus we encounter the phenomenon of a character named by Mark, presumably because he was well known in the early Christian movement, but whose name was dropped by one or both of the later synoptic evangelists, presumably because he was not well known when or where the evangelist wrote. Mark could expect his readers to know of Bartimaeus as a kind of living miracle who made Jesus' act of healing still, so to speak, visible to all who encountered him as a well-known figure in the churches of Jerusalem and Judea. But after his death and after the fall of Jerusalem, which removed the Jewish Christians of Palestine, Bartimaeus was presumably no longer a figure of wide repute, and so Matthew and Luke omitted his name. The tendency of Matthew and Luke to omit some of the names we find in Mark would be explained if these people had become, by the time Matthew and Luke wrote, too obscure for them to wish to retain the names when they were engaged in abbreviating Mark's narrative. Seems stretched when, in the paragraph immediately following, Bauckham offers Cleopas as an example, since Cleopas is only named in Luke's Gospel, not Mark's. In Luke 24:18, Cleopas and a companion encounter Jesus returned from the dead, but divinely disguised so that they could not recognize him, and they show hospitality to the stranger. Bauckham acknowledges that there seems no plausible reason for naming him Cleopas, other than to indicate that he was the source of this tradition. MacDonald offers something different. MacDonald posits that Mark's Bartimaeus and Luke's Cleopas are invented names, each signaling story from the Odyssey. Cleopas is a rare name, appearing only here in the New Testament. The name is derived from kelos or kilos, depending on your pronunciation of the Greek, and translates as all fame or all renown. In Book 19 of the Odyssey, the hero Odysseus, whom many have long presumed dead, returns to his home but is divinely disguised as a beggar. He is shown hospitality, especially by the beloved nurse Euryclea, whose name translates as far-flung fame or far and wide renown. As the nurse bathes the beggar, her hand encounters a prominent scar, well known to her who had cared for and bathed Odysseus in the years before his departure to Troy. Consider her touching reaction as the woman suddenly recognizes her long-lost lord. The old slave woman, holding his leg and rubbing with flat palms, came to that place and recognized the scar. She let his leg fall down into the basin. It clattered, tilted over, and the water spilled out across the floor. Both joy and grief took hold of her. Her eyes were filled with tears. Her voice was choked. She touched his beard and said, "You are Odysseus, my darling child, my master. I did not know it was you until I touched you all around your leg." Considering the salient theme of recognition, as disguised lords presumed dead are revealed alive and confirmed by unmistakable scars. Luke 24 and Odyssey 19 clearly resonate. The invented name Cleopas signals the Odyssey so that those who have ears to hear might listen for imitation and inversion of familiar story. Similarly, MacDonald hears echoes of the blind prophet Tiresias in Mark 10:46-52, signaled by the name Bartimaeus. In Odyssey 11, Odysseus and his crew sail to the edge of ocean, a land of perpetual darkness, where the shining sun, God never looks on them with his bright beams, where destructive night blankets the world, the land of the dead. Odysseus prepares to summon the seer as readers consider the horror of the scene. I promised for Tiresias as well, a pure black sheep, the best in all my flock. So with these vows, I called upon the dead, took the sheep and slit their throats above the pit. Black blood flowed out. The spirits came up out of Erebus and gathered around. Teenagers, girls, and boys, the old who suffered for many years, and fresh young brides whom labor destroyed in youth, and many men cut down in battle by bronze spears, still dressed in armor around the pit with eerie cries. Pale fear took hold of me. I roused my men and told them to flay the sheep that I had killed and burn them and pray to Hades and Persephone. I drew my sword and sat on ground, preventing the spirits of the dead from coming near the blood till I had met Tiresias. Odysseus then encounters the ghost of a recently and tragically departed shipmate, Elpenor. He then sees the ghost of his own mother and pitifully weeps. Finally, the spirit of the unseen seer approaches, recognizing and calls to the hero by name. Zeus-born son of Laertes, Odysseus of many devices. After conversing and receiving from the prophet insight for his journey and foresight about his own death, Odysseus turns again to his mother, who speaks to her son in tones of grief. Then in my heart, I wanted to embrace the spirit of my mother. She was dead, and I did not know how. 3 times I tried, longing to touch her, but 3 times her ghost flew from my arms. Like shadows or like dreams, sharp pain pierced deeper in me as I cried. No, mother, why do you not stay for me and let me hold you even here in Hades? Grief overwhelms the scene. Tiresias himself turns and departs again to the house of Hades. But outside Jericho, city of the moon, a blind man recognizes the one who approaches and cries out, "David's son, Jesus, have mercy on me." Jesus opens the blind man's eyes. He follows Jesus on the road, presumably a road that leads away from or out of Jericho, the city of the moon. If the name Bartimaeus signals Odyssey 11, those who anticipate imitation and inversion discern expectation for the afterlife overturned. Whereas the soul of Tiresias returned to Hades, Bartimaeus left Jericho to travel with Jesus. Herein lies the emulation. Odysseus left Tiresias blind in the netherworld. Jesus cures Bartimaeus. According to MacDonald, the name Bartimaeus may be significant. This is the only name given to a recipient of a miracle in the Synoptic Gospels. Both Matthew and Luke omit it in their accounts. It is quite clear that the names of the beneficiaries do not belong to the genre of gospel miracle stories, so explanation of those names that do occur is certainly required. Bauckham does not seem to make room for the possibility that Mark and the other gospel writers invented names as a literary or rhetorical technique, a mimetic device for signaling some other story. His recovery of the Gospels as testimony presents a reputable historiographic category for reading the Gospels as history, and also a theological model for understanding the Gospels as the entirely appropriate means of access to the historical reality of Jesus, and for realizing the disclosure of God in the history of Jesus. This project is laudable, and the fruit of his efforts have benefited the Academy and Church alike. But by our comparison of Bauckham and MacDonald, scholarly work flayed open, ink like black blood spilling, a gibbering question approaches, a shade summoned from beyond the pale, crying at top of voice, "What about me and you, Jesus, Son of the Most High God?" A monstrous question. We moderns have come to associate truth with the facts of crystallized history. A story is true if it is historically reliable, if it actually happened, as depicted by the facts of historical presentation. But might we not be better to consider a story true as it communicates truth? This question should not imply that the Bible is ahistorical. Rather, the Bible as story more profoundly delivers truth than Bible as history. To read the Bible primarily as history diminishes sacred scripture, reduces it to something hard and unbending, facts to be learned, dogma and doctrine chiseled out from historical texts. Reading the Bible as sacred story moves in and among us different. Dogma is crystal, story is water. Mythos moves like water, shaping and reshaping the landscapes we inhabit. Myth is a formational power, story that communicates significant meaning and truth for a particular culture. Myth shapes shared identity, or we might say, mythos becomes ethos, as the stories we tell translate to the values, ethics, and norms of community, shaping cultural identity. Mythos shapes ethos. The stories we tell follow us out, become the realities we inhabit. And telling a good story is the first step in shaping cultural identity through story is precisely what we discover by attending to mimesis, imitation, or emulation of ancient story. Perhaps ancient epic is a better delivery device for the gospel, because epic delivers the moral, the ethical, the political, the theological, and the universal mythos that profoundly shapes ethos. History, as a telling of historical events, and historiography, history that attempts to convey the truth or meaning of a historical event, and even biography, bios, are not sufficient to do what epic can do. As we discern in what the Aeneid is and what it became for Rome, as with Aeneid, it is not how imitated story is similar, but where imitation diverges, where the stories become different, when imitation becomes inversion. That reveals the meaning of mimesis. Mimesis of Greek and Roman epic story become playful imitation, profoundly communicative of a gospel that turns the world on end. In our own contemporary storied worlds, it is typically villains who monologue, so we return to our exploration of the meaning of mimesis in Mark 5. Gospel writers like Mark conveyed truth that transcends historicity and lives as story. Mimetic markers in Mark are less clear than in the Aeneid. But it is also possible that what is sometimes heard as mimesis is an echo of words or images that live, move, and have their being as poetic memory. An idea that language itself, and especially literary or poetic language, already contains within it the memory of previous texts. The echoes we hear may be intended or unintended, and we need to think of the relation between the Gospels and Greek lore more as dynamic cultural interaction, the complex, random, conscious, and unconscious events of learning that occur when people interact and engage in practices of socialization. Mimesis is a means for creating shared cultural identity, but we modern readers are culturally cut off from the storied worlds of sacred story. As MacDonald observes, today we read these texts with the cultural competence radically different from those for whom they were written. Ancient readers could detect allusions invisible to all but the best trained classicist. Even though the detection of mimesis is difficult, it is one of the most valuable contributions a critic can make for understanding a text. To be sure, one may profitably read a mimetic text for its own sake, but awareness of its model or models allows one to interpret it more comprehensively, more dialogically. In the New Moses, Del Allison comments, our historically conditioned deafness to oblique allusions in the Bible can sometimes lead us to doubt their very existence. Hearing mimesis is profoundly difficult, and endeavors are complicated by the possibility that we may be hearing what our itching ears want to hear. Potential pitfalls are legion. To be sure, MacDonald has his critics, and mimesis criticism is not mainstream. Yet, the prophetic challenge echoes. Let the one who has ears to hear listen. The following attempt at discerning mimesis offers opportunity to listen, see, discover, and learn from the imitation and inversion of familiar or unfamiliar story. What follows is a less rigorous, more playful attempt to discern and make sense of possible mimesis in Mark. As described in the introduction, the loan word for legio, legion, from the Latin legio, or legio, signals an emulation of Vergil's Aeneid, Book 8, which relates the story of Hercules overcoming the monster Cacus to bring relief and rescue to the people. Hearing Hercules in Mark 5 confirms the trajectory of the gospel as it unfolds in Mark's telling of Jesus' story. This play proceeds in 3 moves. First, MacDonald's 7 criteria for detecting dependence on an antecedent text guides and grounds thinking about the possibility of imitation and inversion. Second, the narrative immediately preceding Jesus and the Gerasene demoniac, Jesus calming a storm, reveals the presence of mimesis in familiar story, the tale of Jonah. And third, we read between texts to discern what we might learn if we assume the name Legion signals Vergil's story of Hercules and the monster Cacus. Since boat imagery pervades all 3 stories, Mark 4 through 5, Jonah 1, and Aeneid 8. Why not unfurl the metaphor? We begin by assembling ribs and keel. Move 1. Discerning mimesis. MacDonald proffers 7 criteria for guiding mimesis criticism, by which texts are assessed for evidence that they are direct, extensive, advertised, and hermeneutically freighted imitations of earlier writings. The criteria are noted as follows, with some evidence offered to better justify imitation of Aeneid 8. 1. Accessibility. Was the source text likely available or known? Did the author likely have access to the model text? Vergil's masterful yet unfinished epic, the Aeneid, was published after the poet's death in 19 BCE. Copies of the Latin text disseminated throughout the empire so that by the end of the 1st century CE, the epic's pervasive popularity and influence was undeniable, inspiring artistic representation and widespread celebration of Rome's founding epic. Concerning Hercules, the hero god was the quintessential Greek hero. In antiquity, he featured in more stories and was represented more frequently in art than any other hero or god. He was worshipped by Greeks and Romans, And although the rise of Christianity ultimately meant the demise of his cult, the hero himself continued to fascinate writers and artists, who even proclaimed him as a prototype of Christ. Of importance for this project is the writing of Diodorus Siculus, and specifically Book 4 of his Bibliotheca Historica, in which he recounts the labors or trials of Heracles. This work was likely published in the mid-1st century BCE, not too distant in time from publication of the Aeneid. Scholars are divided over the date of the composition of Mark, most arguing for a date between the late 60s and early 70s of the 1st century CE. 2. Analogy. Do others imitate the source text? Consider first the works previously cited that discern Luke's imitation of Aeneid. Concerning Hercules, MacDonald offers these observations in his book, Christianizing Homer. The careers of Heracles and Christ display tantalizing parallels. Both heroes had divine fathers, Zeus, God, or Yahweh, and mortal mothers, Alcmene, or Mary, whose actual husbands, Amphitryon, Joseph, were from royal stock and accepted the boys as their own sons. Villains, Hera or Herod, try to slay the babies in their cradles by serpents, by swords, but both were spared by precocious flight. Early in life, both youths traveled to a desolate place to be tempted with a choice between easy vice and arduous virtue. Both chose or choose virtue. The careers of both heroes consisted largely of extraordinary ordeals that they overcame through supernatural means. Having acceded to the wills of their divine fathers, both died violent deaths. The bodies of neither could be found. Both became gods. Both appeared to mortals after their deaths, and both ascended to heaven in a cloud. Just as Heracles conquered wild beasts, including the hound Cerberus, whom he fetched from Hades, Jesus conquered demons and preached in hell. Greek philosophical schools transformed Heracles, the giant brute, into a paragon of virtue because he had endured his trials stoically. So many additional details exist between the two heroes that one probably should relate both Heracles and Christ to a common hero ecology. 3. Density. Are there sufficient parallels to demonstrate mimesis as likely? Certainly, clear parallels exist between Mark 4 through 5 and the Odyssey. While parallels between Mark 5 and the Aeneid 8 exist, they are less dense than between Mark and Homer. These details will be more fully described below. 4. Order is the sequencing of events similar enough to signify likely mimesis. As with Criterion 3, stronger parallels exist between Mark 4 through 5 and Odyssey. 5. Distinctive traits. Do texts share anything distinctive? Yes. A chain presents a distinctive trait between Mark 5 and Aeneid 8. You will see the chain. 6. Interpretability. Why does this author imitate the source text? Is it to rival it, etc.? This is the strongest link. Mark signals the story of Hercules and Cacus to clarify the meaning and trajectory of the gospel, as described soon to come. 7 is recognition. Are there ancient or Byzantine recognitions of mimesis? According to Shea, one of the most compelling reasons to explore the works of Vergil in conjunction with the works of early Christianity is because the early Christians canonized him, regarding him as one of the pagan saints or prophets whom Jesus rescues from Satan and the harrowing of hell, common before the Reformation. Fascinatingly, in the Via Latina catacomb, Hercules is present as a figure in funerary depictions alongside Jesus and Lazarus. You could see the images. They're quite fascinating in ancient art. Mark 4:35 to 5:20 offers story as deliverable to children as to wizened adults. The story captivates by its power and simplicity, by its provocative and familiar figures, and by the recognizable message it communicates. A god-man, asleep in a boat while all the others fear for life, rouses to command wind and wave. Be still, and calm is restored. Those traveling with the god-man wonder, who is this, that even the wind and wave obey him? Arriving at a strange land, their wonderment is enlarged and answered by an unexpected character, a monster man tormented and inhabited by a legion of unclean spirits, who lives with the dead, who cannot be chained, who howls, who somehow knows the answer to the question, who is this? With a shout, the monster man names the stranger Jesus, Son of the Most High God. And he then names himself Legion, and he says, for we are many. The Son of the Most High God commands the legion of unclean spirits to leave the man to enter a herd of swine, pigs, who rush down an embankment and plunge into the sea, all drowned. As for the monster man, his humanity is restored, no longer a monster, but a man, a witness to the Lord's mercy. Such a story captivates wide-eyed youths, but has also been equally and extensively contemplated by academically minded adults, some of whom have determined that the section of Mark in which we discover these stories reflects mimesis, imitation that signals the epic story of Homer's Odyssey. Here, I suggest that Vergil's Aeneid is also in view. After all, as MacDonald puts it, apparently Mark wished to do for the early church what Vergil did for the early empire, to provide a compelling narrative about a founding hero. Like Vergil, Mark used the Homeric epics among his models, in addition to the Jewish Bible. I am suggesting that Mark 4:35 to Mark 5:20 reverberate with echoes of both the Odyssey, books 9 through 10, and the Aeneid, book 8. Not only these, but Mark clearly imitates the story of Jonah, a fishtail more easily swallowed as example of mimesis. To demonstrate mimesis, let's begin with the fishtail. In Hades, when Odysseus encounters the specter of famed Achilles, he comments on how good the ghost must have it, worshipped as a god in life, still seemingly revered as one who lords over the dead in spectral power. Achilles will have none of it. He sharply responds, "No willing words about death to me, shining Odysseus. By God, I'd rather slave on earth for another man, some dirt-poor tenant farmer who scrapes to keep alive, than rule down here over all the breathless dead." The words and fate of Achilles leave little hope for good expectation in life after death. See conversation in Homer, the Odyssey, translation by Robert Fagles. Achilles asked Odysseus how he, one of the living and matchlessly clever though he is, had contrived to enter the house of death, where the senseless burnt-out wraiths of mortals make their home. Interestingly, Odysseus's words with dead heroes culminates in meeting Hercules, who relates how he had dragged the great beast Cerberus, hound who guards the dead, up from the underworld to earth and into the light of day. Heroes like Odysseus invading death's realm and returning with boom is a centerpiece of epic story and myth, as has been widely acknowledged and discussed. As an example, consider Joseph Campbell's capture of the story of Heracles and Hesione of Troy. The Greek hero Heracles, pausing at Troy on his way homeward with the belt of the Queen of the Amazons, found that the city was being harassed by a monster sent against it by the sea god Poseidon. The beast would come ashore and devour people as they moved about on the plain. Beautiful Hesione, the daughter of the king, had just been bound by her father to the sea rocks as a propitiatory sacrifice, and the great visiting hero agreed to rescue her for a price. The monster in due time broke to the surface of the water and opened its enormous maw. Heracles took a dive into the throat, cut his way out through the belly, and left the monster dead. Campbell describes this descent into death as entering the belly of the well, from which the hero re-emerges, reborn as it were. Heracles willingly enters death's maw, but then opens a womb out of which he is born again, and others, like Hesione, share in the salvation or boon afforded by the hero's escape or rebirth out of death. Likely those familiar with biblical stories immediately associate belly of the well imagery with Jonah, reluctant prophet who spent 3 days ruminating in a fish gut timeout. The story of Jonah is a Bible story. Indeed, in each of their Gospels, Matthew and Luke explicitly reference the prophet and seem to assume familiarity with the story among their readers. Mark's Gospel does not explicitly refer to Jonah. However, the story of Jonah functions intertextually by the obvious allusion to the Jonah story and the story of Jesus stilling the storm in all 3 synoptic Gospels, and specifically in Mark, who implicitly makes reference to not only the story of Jonah, but also to Moses and Elijah, both of whom are alluded to in Jonah as well. To be sure, the story of Jonah offers a compelling narrative and provocative themes that invert expectation, meaning the prophet as reluctant, salvation not from, but by a monster, salvation extended to unexpected others, like Gentiles or Ninevites, if you're using the Gospels comparing it to Jonah's story. A rich subtext from which meaning and insight percolate into Gospel stories as writers and readers make sense of Jesus. Jonah is indeed a familiar story. Readers familiar with the story are unlikely to be disturbed by discerning the prophet as intertextual figure in Mark's Gospel. Consider the clear allusions to Jonah presented by Mark 4:35-41, the stilling of the storm. Table 1, Imitation of Jonah 1 in Mark 4:35-41. On the left side, Jonah in chapter 1. On the right side, Mark chapter 4:35-41. Departure by boat. Jonah boards a ship. Yahweh hurls a great wind upon the sea. Jesus gets in a boat. A great gale or wind arises. Violent storm at sea. Great storm threatens to break up the ship. Waves beat into the boat so that it becomes swamped. Sleeping main chamber. Jonah is asleep in the hold of the ship. Jesus is asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. Frightened crew sailors are afraid and cry out to their gods. The captain wakes Jonah. Disciples wake. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Miraculous calm related to main character. Jonah is thrown into the sea. The sea calms. Jesus rebukes wind and waves. The storm calms. Marveling response from crew. The sailors fear Yahweh even more. They sacrifice and offer vows. Disciples are filled with awe and question, who is this that even the wind and waves obey him? In Mark, the story of Jesus stilling the storm is saturated with allusion to Jonah. Yet, the prophet is not explicitly named or referenced, neither in chapter 4:35-41, nor in the rest of the gospel. Yet, Jonah as a backdrop is further confirmed by the prophet's appearance in Matthew and Luke, where Jesus refers to the sign of Jonah as the only sign offered to an evil generation who requests a sign. Despite lack of explicit reference to the Jonah story in Mark, for those with ears to hear the intertextuality, allusion confirms that someone greater than Jonah is here. But this connection, this confirmation, is made clear not only because of imitation, how Jonah's story provides the setting and imagery for Jesus, verse storm, and not to derail, but several scholars have noticed how the myth of Jonah is influenced by the Argonautic myth. Those are my additions, MythVision, and you can go to Bruce Loudon in his book called Homer's Odyssey and the Near East to find out in chapter 7 where he has a chapter on Odysseus and Jonah, sea monsters, and the fantastic voyage. But especially because of inversion, how the story of Jesus turns Jonah's story on its head to create new meaning. Consider the following distinctions or inverted aspects between the Jonah and Jesus stories. Look at the charts. Jonah's on the left, Mark's on the right. Let's start with the left and I'll read left to right and move downward. Jonah tries to escape the presence of Yahweh by fleeing on a boat. Jesus reveals or embodies the divine presence by his command over the elements. Jonah boards the boat to avoid proclaiming a message to the non-Hebrew Ninevites. Jesus boards the boat to cross to the other side, the Gentile country of the Gerasenes. Jonah sleeps in the belly of the ship. There's concern that he should wake and do something. Jesus sleeps in the stern of the ship on a cushion. There is concern that he should wake and do something. The sailors question Jonah, "Who are you? Where are you from? Who are your people?" The disciples call Jesus teacher, then question, "Who is this?" Even the wind and wave obey him. The sailors fear angering the god by killing an innocent man. The disciples fear that they themselves perishing. Jonah is thrown overboard and the raging storm subsides. Jesus himself commands the raging storm, "Peace, be still." And the storm subsides. Jonah is swallowed and saved by a great fish and spends 3 days in the belly of the whale. Jesus is not swallowed by a great fish and does not spend time in the belly of the whale. To be sure, despite imitation, at the end of Mark 4, Jesus is not swallowed by a great fish and does not spend time in the belly of a whale. Echoes of Jonah generate anticipation that a belly of the whale experience approaches. Readers, hearers, must look, listen, wait for it. In this case, the belly of the whale, a heroic confrontation with death, is made evident in Mark 5 through playful mimesis with Aeneid 8, where Hercules, not Jesus, dives headlong into the thick smoke darkness of a fierce monster's lair, a move that anticipates Jesus' own descent into Hades, story of Christ's underworld journey that came to be a central aspect of the early centuries of Christian faith. If Mark, moving beyond the Hebrew scriptures we anticipate, signals story from Homer and Vergil, then mimesis helps Mark make sense of the meaning of the cross. And if, as Culpeper claims, close examination of the Gospel of Mark shows that the shadow of the cross falls across the entire Gospel, so that every pericope points ahead to the cross and must be understood in its light, then mimesis offers a sense-making strategy for discerning what Mark means by Gospel of Jesus Christ. The concept of death and rebirth is prominent within the legend of Heracles, and it is closely connected to the concept of kleos. This is illustrated in 2 places that feature the story of Heracles. The first place, as narrated by Diodorus, depicts Heracles descending into Hades, whereupon he captures and delivers Cerberus from the place of darkness, death, to the place of light, life. It is not uncommon within Greek tragedy and other genres for a character to enter into Hades, only to return again later. Traversing from Earth into Hades and back is meant to depict the process of death and resurrection, which was understood as the ultimate form of kleos. The story of Heracles' resurrection ends with his being awakened in Olympus, where he is welcomed amongst the gods as one of their own. And so, the immortality that is often expressed in Greek literature with regard to kleos is most explicitly illustrated in the life and death of Heracles. Story about the identity of Jesus is to be told and understood in light of his death and resurrection. I want to suggest that what Mark, Luke, and others are doing by putting stories about Jesus into conversation with stories from the Hebrew Bible and also with Greek and Roman mythos, what they are doing is profoundly rooted in a clear-eyed understanding of the meaning of the cross, the gospel of Jesus' death and resurrection. It may be that it is difficult for us to recognize what they are doing, how and why they so playfully engage and imitate story, because we ourselves are missing a clear-eyed understanding of the meaning of the gospel. MacDonald's mythologizing Jesus entertains a possibility that the Mark 5 story of Jesus exorcising a demoniac possessed by a legion of unclean spirits exhibits intentional mimesis of Odyssey books 9 and 10, where Odysseus overcomes first a monstrous cyclops, Polyphemus, and then a bewitching queen, Circe. MacDonald captures elements of mimesis in this chart, with a bit added for clarification. Table 3, mimesis between Mark and Odyssey 9 and 10. Again, as before, we're going to read Odyssey 9 and 10 on the left and the narration to the right, with Mark working from top to bottom. In the first case, there's nothing on the Odyssey side, so we start with Mark. This narrative is immediately preceded by a story of Jesus asleep in a boat as winds howl and waves rage. Jesus wakes and calms the storm, provoking the response, "Who is this that even the wind and waves obey him?" Odyssey. Odysseus and his crew sailed to the land of the Cyclops and of Circe. Jesus and his disciples sailed to the region of the Gerasenes. On the mountain of the Cyclopes, countless goats grazed. Circe turned Odysseus's comrades into swine. On the mountains, a large herd of swine gazed, about 2,000. Odysseus and crew went ashore. Jesus and his disciples went ashore. They discovered a savage, lawless giant who lived in a cave. They discovered a lawless, demon-possessed man who lived among the caves. Polyphemus usually was depicted nude. The name Polyphemus means something like many voices or much speaking. Mark, the man was nude. Circe recognized Odysseus and asked him not to harm her. The giant asked if Odysseus had come to harm him. The man recognized Jesus and asked him not to harm him. The giant asked Odysseus his name. Jesus asked the man his name. Odysseus answered, "Nobody." The cleverness here is in the wordplay. Utis. Nobody is a play on Odysseus. The man answered, "Legion." Legion for we are many. Legion is a Latin term, not a Greek term. Odysseus subdued the giant with violence and trickery. Circe had turned Odysseus' soldiers to swine. Odysseus overcame Circe with a special gift from Hermes, a flower that made ineffectual her magic of transformation. Jesus subdued the demons with a word and sent them into the swine and then into the lake. The shepherd, the Cyclops, called out to his neighbors. The swineherds reported to his neighbors. The Cyclops came to the site asking about Polyphemus' sheep and goats. The neighbors came to the site to find out about their swine. Odysseus and his crew boarded ship. Jesus and his disciples boarded ship. Odysseus told the giant to broadcast that he had blinded him. Jesus told the hilled monster man to broadcast what God had done for him. The giant asked Odysseus, now on the ship, to come back. The man asked Jesus, now on ship, if he could be with him. Odysseus refused the request. Jesus refused the request. Odysseus and his crew sailed away. Jesus and his disciples sailed away. Odysseus awoke during a storm in the episode immediately following Polyphemus, wind and wave against Odysseus. To be sure, some may feel that the presentation of information in MacDonald's book can feel tedious. Charts like this making comparisons between text, it could seem a bit stretched. While I myself find MacDonald's work exciting, provocative, and insightful, his observations sometimes leave me with questions. Why imitate this particular story at all? What's the intention behind this example of Mimesis? MacDonald suggests that Mark intends readers to mark Jesus as superior to Homer's hero, Odysseus. Whereas Odysseus blinded a monster, Jesus made a monster sane. Similarly, Circe turned soldiers into swine for eating, but Jesus cast the legion of demons into the swine to return the madman to sanity. Here again, Jesus is a hero of compassion. So in this explanation, we do get a sense of inversion as the energy, the intent behind Mimesis tells a familiar story, but undue expectation through inversion, revealing the superior character and power of Jesus as hero. And Mimesis is not allegory, as if the demon-possessed man is analogous to the Cyclops or Jesus is analogous to Odysseus, because in Mimesis, there's too much blurring of the lines. For example, Odysseus and his men rush out of the cave on the bellies of beasts and race for the water to make their escape. But in Mark, demons enter swine and rush headlong to the water and drown. Or Odysseus shares Circe's bed after she makes an oath not to harm him. But in Mark, request for a similar oath has a very different outcome, even though one of the characters is already naked. Yet the question persists. Why Mimesis with this particular story? It's not a stretch to conclude that Jesus is more compassionate than Odysseus. Many are more compassionate than Odysseus. Just read the Odyssey and see. Odysseus does not set a very high bar. To make sense of Mimesis, we might suggest that Xenia, or the broken hospitality central to the story between Odysseus and Polyphemus, is the point of Mark's narrative. Despite his clear power over demons, the people of the region want Jesus and his crew out of there immediately. Their lack of hospitable welcome is judged in light of the Mimesis. Or we might suggest that power over the monstrous is the point of mimesis. If Odysseus is able to best a monster and tame a sorceress through trickery and violence, how much superior to him is Jesus, who commands a horde of demons with only a word? Now we may be getting closer to discerning intent behind mimesis, but surely mimesis is more than a device to convey superiority of compassion or power. Why this mimesis of the monster's cave? I want to suggest a linguistic clue that may reveal that this isn't the only monster's cave Mark has in view. The name legion has long mystified scholars. Legio is a Latin term describing a company within the Roman army comprising around 5,000 soldiers. So of course, many demons, like soldiers, acting in concert to colonize this man might well be considered a legion. While Luke's telling of this same story includes the name legion, Matthew completely drops this name from his version of the story, which is interesting since he deploys the term later in his gospel to describe the legion of angels that might save Jesus if he chose to call for rescue. The voices of scholars trying to make sense of legion are many, and their variety of approaches begs the question, why the sudden odd insertion of this Roman military imperial term into the story of Mark 5, 1-20? Legion, as noted, is a Latin term, a term with specific militaristic, imperialistic reference. Above, we attended to mimesis with the Odyssey, and while my name is Legion for we are many might point to Polyphemus, whose name means many voices, could it be that Mark's Latinism here signals a different story? A Roman story to which we ought to attend? In his Aeneid, Vergil certainly imitated Odysseus' encounter with the Cyclopes. Caesar Augustus, the first Roman emperor, commissioned Vergil to compose the Aeneid, an epic poem in Latin that accounts the journey of heroic Aeneas, whose fated flight from Troy ultimately initiates the founding of Rome. Much of the Aeneid is Vaticanum ex eventu, storytelling that depicts known history as if prophesied about in the distant past. Twice in the epic, a tongue of fire ignites above the heads of characters who anticipate the coming of a kingdom. Roman rule, as it is established throughout centuries and culminates in Augustus and the Pax Romana, Roman peace throughout the world. The Aeneid was no mere story. Much like the works of Homer, the Aeneid carried and conveyed Roman values. Indeed, Augustus intended the epic as a means for return to traditional moral values, not least the piety and manliness they understood as necessary for properly ordering the world. And Vergil's mimesis of Iliad and Odyssey is rich and playful and creative. Aeneas is portrayed as hero far surpassing Odysseus in all ways, in cleverness, morality, virility, and devotion. So in Book 3 of the Aeneid, readers are not surprised to discover Aeneas arriving upon the Cyclopes shore, just as Odysseus had done. Yet here, we encounter not a Polyphemus-like monster, but a man, a Greek, one of Odysseus' sailors who had been left behind by his commander. The sailor begs kind Aeneas to take him on board and away from this cursed land. And though the Greeks had been Troy's bane and brought death and destruction to Aeneas' family, home, and people, Aeneas welcomes the sailor, demonstrating care of the stranger far superior to the hospitality displayed between Odysseus and Polyphemus. In the end, the monster does show up, and the Greek, together with the Trojans, make a harrowing escape. But in the Aeneid, this is not the only instance of a mimesis of the Polyphemus story, and it is to this instance that I want to draw our attention. Indeed, I am suggesting that Mark's unexpected deployment of the Latin term legion is itself intended to signal that we are to pay attention to Aeneid. Book 8 seems to me the heart of Aeneid. This is where Aeneas receives his armor from Venus, his mother, armor divinely engraved with the living history of Rome, all that is to come, flashing forth from the shield of Aeneas as vibrant Vaticanum ex eventu. Armed literally with his destiny, Aeneas is equipped to battle legions. At the end of Book 7, we see armies gathering for a battle that will decide the fate of future Rome. And both here and early in Book 9, the word legio, or legion, is used to describe the forces gathering for war. Early in Book 8, Aeneas is instructed by the river god to journey up the Tiber and beseech the help of a people there who will ally with them for battle. Aeneas makes the journey, and the people he encounters are sitting down to a great feast, a yearly rite of celebration and thanksgiving for a savior who rid their land of a terrible monster. As Aeneas sits down to feast and enjoys their hospitality, he is told the story of Hercules, worshipped as a god here, who defeated Cacus, a fierce monster who had been terrorizing the people and stealing their cattle. The name Cacus is a play on the Greek word for bad or evil, and the story that ensues is clearly mimetic of the Odyssey in its description of the gore-filled cave where Cacus resides. To illustrate Vergil's Mimesis of Odyssey, first, listen to this exchange between Odysseus and Polyphemus as he and his men reach their boat and attempt to make escape. They swung aboard. They sat to the oars in rank, and in rhythm churned the water white with stroke on stroke. But once offshore, as far as a man's shout can carry, I called back to the Cyclops, singing taunts. So, Cyclops, no weak coward it was whose crew you bent to devour. There in the vaulted cave, with you your brute force, your filthy crimes came down on your own head. You shameless cannibal, daring to eat your guest in your own house. So Zeus and the other gods have paid you back. That made the rage of the monster boil over. Ripping off the peak of a towering crag, he heaved it so hard the boulder landed just in front of our dark prow, and a huge swell reared up as the rock went plunging under, a tidal wave from the open sea. The sudden backwash drove us landward again, forcing us close inshore, but grabbing a long pole, I thrust us off and away, tossing my head for dear life, signaling crews to put their backs in the oars, escape grim death. Odyssey 9, 527 to 545. Now, back to the Aeneid, where the hero is told that Hercules finally discovered the cave of Cacus, but the monster had run inside and had broken the chain that suspended a great boulder above the cavern's entrance, a stone so massive that not even Hercules could push it away. Indeed, the god-man tried 3 times to move the stone, but could not. But Hercules was undaunted, and we ought pay attention to what happens next, because I think this is what Mark wants us to hear as he imitates this story in the story of Jesus and Legion. Hercules gnashed his teeth and peered all over for a way in. A flint spire, with the rocks cut off on all sides, rose from the cave's roof, dizzying to see, a fitting place for ghastly birds to nest. It slanted from the ridge above the river on the left. By wrenching from the right, he freed it and tore it from its roots and shoved it over. The heights of heaven thundered with the impact. The stream fled backward, terrified the banks burst. Now Cacus's cavernous palace was laid open, its shadowy depths exposed, as if some power should split the earth, clear the habitations of Hades, and uncover that pale kingdom the gods hate. From above, the huge abyss would show, and spirits tremble at the light. The monster then, caught in the sudden daylight in the rocky hole, had never howled like this. As Hercules harassed him from above with everything at hand, Hercules pinned and throttled the monster until his eyes popped and his throat was dry and bloodless. Now, with the doors torn off, the black lair open, the heavens saw looted cowls he tried to hide. The hideous corpse was pulled out by the feet. Men could not satisfy their hearts with gazing upon the defeated monster. Vergil, the Aeneid, 8, 229 to 265. Pause and consider what we just heard recounted. A god-man breaks open a cavernous hell to expose the monster and the gore-strewn cave to daylight. A comparison is made to what might happen if the same event were to expose Hades, so that blinking ghosts are left trembling in unanticipated light. This is precisely what becomes the story of Christus Victor, where the cross, like a Trojan horse, becomes transport for the god of light. Transport down into death and Hades, where iron doors are torn open and darkness is forever transformed so that Hades and death no longer hold ultimate destiny for human souls. Darkness transformed by light, the monster exposed, uncovered, defeated. Where, O death, is thy victory, thy sting? Another element in Mark's story helps confirm the intentional mimesis here. The man possessed by Legion is said to have always broken his restraining chains. Nowhere in the Polyphemus narrative are broken chains mentioned, but here in the Cacus story, the monster breaks the chain suspending the great boulder. Those familiar with these stories hear how playful mimesis generates meaning upon meaning, deepens the implications of Jesus healing this demoniac, as if the story was ever intended to be heard as mere historical narrative. No, the story is a delivery device for the gospel itself. The good news of a God-man who saves not only some from the evil Cacus, but who saves all by triumphing over death and Hades. What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me. Legion's question and request might well be our own, but we know the end of the story, a story with a good news ending, and legions make escape from that foul cavern squealing. So here, at the end, I return to the problem with which we began. It may be that it is difficult for us to recognize what Mark and others are doing by mimesis, how and why they so playfully engage and imitate story, because we ourselves don't really have a clear-eyed understanding of the meaning of the gospel. But this reread of Mark 5 encourages me, and when I meet my own 21st century Achilles, one who worries over death and in despair breathes the words, "By God, I'd rather slave on earth than rule downstairs over all the breathless dead," then I can ask, hey, have you heard the one about Christus Victor? It's a hell of a story. Playful mimesis generates meaning upon meaning, deepens the implications of story as delivery device for truth. While our unfamiliarity with ancient and classical story hinders recognition of mimesis, it may be that it is difficult for us to recognize what gospel writers are doing by mimesis, how and why they so playfully engage and imitate story, because we ourselves don't really have a clear-eyed understanding of the meaning of the gospel. But story can be playful because truth is not fully captured by words. In the beginning was the Word, God as one who lives behind and above and among and within our words, but never exclusively as our words. So understanding my own just so stories as myth reminds me that they resonate with and point to and are sometimes incarnations of the Word, but they are not the Word, not exclusively truth, because truth is not fully capturable as words. I truly hope you enjoyed this entire documentary, which is based around Chris Rosser's work. Chris Rosser is a Christian, and he recognizes the playful beauty in imitation as they colorfully mythologize narrative in a new context. We live in a day where apologists day in and day out argue for literal truth, and those on the opposite spectrum of being atheist or antagonistic to the Christian position also get caught up in this literalist interpretation, categorizing the New Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, in this literalistic fashion. By doing so, I think we have lost sight of what these texts are doing and how they are colorfully rewriting mythos and packaging it into new contexts. If we do that, we can get away from necessarily the back and forth apologist, anti-apologist rhetoric, and we can find meaning upon meaning, layer upon layer of interesting ideas that we can apply to our own lives today. I wanted to highlight a Christian's work because I can see in this what I think is happening and is true. As someone who calls themselves an atheist, I don't want to just create a community of people who only think like me in regards to ontology. I want a community of people made up of theist, agnostic, atheist, you name it, wherever you're at, that can recognize without that fundamentalism of literalist history needing to be the case. Let's take back the ancient literature, bring back the humanities, if you will, and find common ground with people who are willing to go where they see the evidence point, away from the absurdities of literalistic thinking pertaining to these stories. And with that being said, I truly hope you appreciate what I try to do